In the previous chapter, at the end of the 5th century, Rome fell into the hands of the German nations. Africa and Spain, as well, were invaded. Jews were moving east, and Judea had become a Holy Land. As for religious mixture, Orthodox Christianity was dominant. Catholic Christianity had not formed yet, and religious tolerance was at its low point for a while. I would like to point out that the Germanic nations were not actually barbaric. They were just called that way. They were generally quite civilized as a people. There is a big temptation to wonder what was life like for the general population of the time. I will make it short. It was pretty awful. There was famine and disease. There was debt, taxes, and economic instability. There was ethnic strife. There was physical pain and frequent medical conditions which no one could cure. And on top of that, there was a religious bullying by the clergy. There were very few civil rights. Women were considered property. Slaves, serfs, and servants had even less rights. The feudal system was forming. No wonder life expectancy was low. Yet people lived, and people laughed, and people had families. What was it like living back then as a Jew? It couldn't have been easy for anyone, for sure. Was it a significant life? I suppose it was. Jews were generally religious and worked hard for a living. Families were big then, but there was a lot of mortality, so you couldn't really get attached too often, and yet one did. The Jews prayed in synagogues, they bathed in ritual baths, they celebrated festivals, they rested on the Sabbath. They were also very busy yearning for the Messiah, a human representation of God, who will take charge of the world and restore Jewish glory. Apparently, some are still waiting. Fear would stop by quite often, like a pigeon that is stubbornly perched on your balcony. There were ethnic fears, for the Jews were a minority everywhere. There was economic instability. There was internal religious violence and crime. There was inequality. Aging was less of a problem for women, but death and pestilence were there. God was also present all the time, like a good friend, an invisible partner in life. He provided hope and emotional support. He made sense in a world where there wasn't a great deal of sense, and there was a great void in knowledge and certainty. Emperor Justinian was the Eastern Roman Empire. He took the reins in 527 AD. He was a devout Christian as well. The next 40 years were dedicated by him to establishing new Roman law, reconquering North Africa, Italy, and Spain. He also fought the Sassanians and was generally very active. Justinian was to become deeply involved in religious issues, both inside the Christian world and outside for the non-Christians. Jews and Samaritans were restricted, and much of their religious privileges were reduced. This did not make them happy. Justinian faced significant opposition from the Samaritans, who for some reason resisted conversion into Christianity. Two major Samaritan revolts took place in the 6th century. This had the impact on Jewish life as well in the Galilee and in Judea. Jews were forbidden to construct new synagogues, for example, and were expelled from many of the cities. The plague of Justinian had devastated most of the Mediterranean basin. It was a form of Black Death. It also hit in Mesopotamia, Judea, Persia, North Africa. It raised havoc. About a third of Roman Empire population was hit. Lives were not the same. The economy went down the toilet. The tax bases had dwindled to nothing because people were running, and the army was unable to function. Part of the outcome of the Justinian plague was an increase in taxes, and that was a significant factor impacting where people chose to live. People moved to where the taxes were less. Jews moved east to the area controlled by Arabs and Sassanians to avoid religious persecution and overwhelming taxation. We are about to hear more about the Sassanians soon. They were of the Zoroastrian persuasion. They controlled all of the area of Persia and much of Mesopotamia. Furthermore, they were very religious people with much skill, ingenuity, wisdom. They were also incredible archers and horsemen. Rome had never been able to fight them. During the Byzantine-Sassanian War that started at 602 and ended at 628, the Sassanians were able to take over Jerusalem and much of the Levant, a conquering army had quite a few Persian Jewish soldiers who partook in the conquest of Jerusalem. For about 15 years, Jerusalem was under Sasanian Jewish rule, but a peace accord was negotiated, and Jerusalem was retaken by the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine-Sasanian wars exhausted both parties. There was the plague, the wars, the expansion, and the monumental building in Constantinople. All this put the Byzantine Empire into a lot of financial stress. By the time the Arabs had finished their preparation to invade most of the world, both the Sasanians and the Byzantines needed a break, and a break is the exact opposite of what they got. While all this was taking place, the Jewish diaspora in Europe had been living a peaceful existence. Italy came under the Lombards, and the Jews were generally accepted. I say generally, but there was a lot of religious stress and bullying. Of all things, they were always in a dilemma: to practice or not to practice, to be, convert. From time to time, new laws were dished out to reduce their rights, expel them from the industry, and punish them if they made mistakes. In Iberia, under the Visigoths, things were less stable for the Jews. During the 6th century, the Visigoths converted from their Arian heresy to the traditional Orthodox Catholic persuasion. Under the influence of the Catholic clergy, Jude had much of their practice restricted. Many Jews were forcefully converted. Some were expelled and their property confiscated. Some were killed. Religious Jews were punished horribly for practicing certain traditions. During the 6th and 7th centuries, the Iberian Jewish community had ups and downs, but mostly downs. And in Arabia, the Prophet Muhammad had been uniting the Arab tribes under the Islam faith. The Arabs controlled all of Arabia, much of Persia and Mesopotamia. Many of the nations that were taken over chose to convert to the Islam faith. The time was right for Islam to become popular fast. Islam reduced the complexity of the belief system and concentrated its dogma on God and on the Prophet. It was actually a very beautiful message. The Arabs at the time were several nations of both sedentary and nomadic ways of life. They traded with the Mediterranean bases. They used both freight and racing camels for transport, and in their internal wars, which plenty they had, their relationship and understanding of the camel and of their own turf became an advantage in their future warfare against the world. In 638 AD, the Byzantine Empire suffered a humiliating defeat in a battle that was called the Battle of the Yarmouk, which took place naturally by the Yarmouk River in Transjordan. The Arabs were able to travel faster, they were lighter, they were motivated by religious zeal, they were a volunteer army. They were equipped with Damascus steel swords, light bows, and a very short temper. The Arab advantage was overwhelming. The camel, which two people could ride at the same time, was like a war chariot. The Byzantine horses had difficulties facing the camels. The camels were higher, faster, stronger, scarier. Horses backed off just by the smell of camels. And boy, 100,000 camels do produce a bit of a smell. I would like to end the narrative here. It is 638 AD. Jerusalem, much of Syria, much of Mesopotamia and Persia taken over by a Muslim Arab civilization. Jews were living under several restrictions, both in Europe and in North Africa, and everywhere you went, camels ruled the scene.